or
We are?
are recording it now?
No, I think that was a mistake.
Like just one, it's not just one instance, right, where the criminal injustice system really affects us, right? It's a whole it's a whole history, right? It didn't start with me, it didn't start with Joe Lewis, it didn't start with Alejandro and our families and our communities and things like that, right? Well, but not, it didn't start just with us, it started with our communities, it started with how they were shaped to be, right? And so I just want to like kind of reflect a little bit on some things that I learned while I was a student at UC Santa Barbara, earning my degree in Chicana and Chicano studies. So while I was out there, I learned that Black and Brown students they get harsher punishments for the same misbehavior as white students. It's most likely for Black and Brown youth to experience incarceration than it is for Black and Brown men of color to get to receive or earn a bachelor's degree. And so when thinking about these things, and I think about my experience, right, and also thinking about my community and the things around me, right? So like my community, I grew up in a neighborhood that was once redlined, right? So in the neighborhood that I lived in, there was developers who said like, there's a bunch of Mexican people who live in this neighborhood, so we're gonna shade this area red so that way, investors and public and private entities know that this is a risky place to invest their money. Don't invest money, right? Don't invest in their education. Don't invest in resources and programs that help their mental health. Don't invest in pathways towards college for the people that live in this area right here, right? And so that was before I was born, right? And going fast forward to when I was born and looking around my community, like the only thing that I would see, like for example, in the media, were things like like Fox News portraying my gente as like illegals and people that don't belong here in this country, right? So people who didn't belong, I would grow up watching Cops, right? And who's on Cops? Bunch of Black and brown young men getting criminalized, getting chased by the police. So like that's what I saw myself as, right? I saw myself as like a criminal who didn't belong here. Like that's something that I started growing up with, right? And then of course I had I had family members and like cousins that were gang banging at that time when I was younger, and so like that was the community that I grew up with, right? A lot of these communities that are not served are historically underserved because of racist policies like redlining. You get communities or gangs that start off as mutual aid or as organizations that resist racist police or segregationist teens and things like that, right? But then they evolve, and that's actually the history of the gang in the neighborhood that I grew up in. Like they started off as a mutual aid. They started off as teenagers who would basically protect themselves from police that would come and beat the crap out of them. They would protect themselves from teenagers who believed in segregation, right? That's how it started off. But of course, through time it evolves and things like that, right? And so, just going through the motions, just seeing all these things around me, like I thought that was my future right there, right? Just getting into fights, getting into getting in trouble and things like that, right? Because that was me all through middle school and high school. I would just go to school, I'll fight with my enemies, I would sell drugs and things like that, and I didn't grow up with a dad in the picture, right? So it's like like my dad left my family when I was like in third grade and stuff like that, right? So it's like I didn't have positive male images of myself growing up, right? So the images that I saw of myself were not positive images, right? It wasn't until I took the world history class and they talked about Zapata and Villa, and I was like, wow, like Mexicans do good things. Like that was the first time I ever like really thought about that, right? And so just like really talking about like these systems that push us towards like incarceration and things like that. When I talked about how Black and brown students get harsher punishments than white students for the same misbehavior. Like I remember reflecting on this and thinking thinking back to a time when I was like sitting in a table in my classroom in my high school, and there was four kids to that table. All of them were Latinos except one white kid, right? And then it turns out like later on in that day, I got called into the office. Somebody got their phone stolen and things like that, right? And I got searched, right? Like I got searched. The next day we came back, we talked about it, right? We were like, hey, like, did you get searched? Like, yeah, like they said somebody got their phone stolen, this and that, right? And the only person that didn't get searched was the white kid sitting with us. And he acknowledged it. He was like, oh, it's because us white people stick together, you know, like, and he was just playing around. He was clowning around, right? But like,
he knew. He
knew,
understood the context, even if he was joking.
That.
Yeah. Thank you, Fabian.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you mind? I'm gonna give the Joe Lewis or Alejandro a chance to jump in. How has the injustice system affected you and your family, your communities?
Go ahead, Joe. Go ahead, bro.
I think for myself personally, right, like Fabian broke it down pretty nicely, right? Like the history and all that stuff. And I come from some heavily Latinx community. I'm from Southgate, Watts, right next to Centro, Bill Gardens, you know. But I think personally, right, like I have that impact where with myself. Right, I was first put on probation when I was 14 years old. I think by then, I had already started using drugs, gang banging, right, and everything that comes, you know, with that lifestyle. You know, I think the first time I was incarcerated was 19 for possession of a loaded weapon, you know, but I think you grow up in this mentality for myself, right, and the impact of that community is it's weird to come to a community like Mt.SAC, right, where you begin to like coalesce around majors. Like in my community, we began to coalesce around like, who's your probation officer, right? Like, who's your parole officer? Like, oh, you got this person, you got that person, you know. So I think personally in the communities that I come from, right, I live in La Puente right now, and I see, right, like what happens, right, because of the criminalization of bodies, you know. So myself, I think it impacted me really heavily, right, not being able to get a job, worried, right, you know, like if I apply for a job, like thinking about it, right, like if I wasn't the coordinator of Rising Scholars and I was informally incarcerated for a formerly incarcerated student program, would I even have got this job? Right, I think, you know, thinking about, you know, that's something that most people don't have on their mind, right, as they're applying to jobs, no matter, right, like skin color, but like now it's like, are they gonna find something? Are they not gonna like, you know, and I think, so that's how it impacted myself. And then also it creates a scarlet letter and a sense of internalized stigmatization, right? Where sometimes I'm the only person in the room that has ever been incarcerated, right? Like I'm the only person in the room, right, that, like, I went to jail one time just because my name was Joe Hernandez and I was Latino, right? Like just for those two reasons, nobody checked my birthday, nobody checked my social, and then they released me, right? Like, you know, like I've experienced all that, and I think so personally, right, that's the impact that it has, where you begin to internalize, right, when what Fabian talked about, right, is you see outside of the world what it tells you, and then you become what the world tells you are, right? So then you leave that world, and now you continue to kind of like drag behind, right, like,
of course,
what that world is, you know. Yeah. I think that's how it impacted me personally, and I have friends, right, like doing life, and I have friends, right, that still want to live a specific life that I don't want to live no more. So like, what do? I have to like not hang out.
Yeah, the control expands beyond the sentence itself, right? They continue controlling your life after that. Yeah. Alejandro, how about you? How has the injustice system impacted your community, the people around you?
Thank you. First, before I begin, you know, anything, my part, I do want to acknowledge you know, the things that have happened in this past 2 days, right? With the criminalization of our Haitian brothers, right? In the hands of police, right? In the hands of ICE, of Border Patrol, that the anti-Black policies and anti-immigrant policies that put our brothers in jail and in the system, right? As well as recognize the ancestors that have been murdered, right? That have been murdered in the hands of the police for being bad hombres, right? Brothers like Andres Guardado, right? An 18-year-old Salvadorian American man shot in the back by deputy sheriffs from LA County Sheriff's Department, right? David Ortiz Jr., right? Killed by LA sheriffs when he was having a mental health issue, right? Edwin Rodriguez, Jose Mendez, Fred Barragan, Anthony Vargas, Cesar Rodriguez, Jesse Romero, and many, many more. These are our brothers that are constantly being killed, and not one more. And we say their names and we honor them, right? Because we bring them into this space when we're having these conversations. Because we say basta, we say no more killings, no more people in our jails, right? And we do it for them, right? We do it for the homies that didn't make it, right? That aren't on the LA Times, right? That we know are local heroes and local brothers that you know passed away in the hands of the police, right? So with that, you know, I'll begin what I'm saying. So how am I affected by police? By policing, mass incarcerations, criminal injustice? Personally, me, when I was 13, I went through some real traumatic stuff in terms of my father passed away. He burned alive in a car crash on Valley Boulevard, right? Right where Mt.SAC is at, right? Valley Boulevard, you just go all the way down. And that kind of started a series of just a lot of traumatic mental health you know, experiences that I had, right? I was really angry. I was pissed just because I saw my father pass away, you know, burned alive, and a lot of this, right? What followed was me just being angry in class and campus in middle school, right? Lashing out and really just trying to having low self-esteem issues, which allowed me to like be taken in by a group that people that really didn't care about me, right? Really didn't want to, not real homies, right? Not people that really wanted to see me grow. And I started, you know, doing drugs and doing a lot of other stuff, right? Stealing from my community. The series was that basically I was pushed out from my middle school, which was then Rincon Intermediate, or now known as Telesis, because I grew up in the West Covina, La Puente area. And I was kicked out and placed in community day school, which is an alternative high school. But this school was not an ordinary school. They had police searches every single day. We needed to get searched. We had dog searches weekly. We needed to get drug tested. In order to exit the school, we needed to also do community service and constantly checking with police officers. And a lot of my classmates did go to juvenile hall, right? But they had that when they came out, they needed to be placed in there because we were a danger to go back into normal schools, right? So these are schools that exist in every single district, by the way, y'all. Every single district has something similar like this or had it in the past, right? And is now taking it away because of public description, public talk, right? So I got placed out of there, finally went into normal high school, Nogales High School. And I was there for 2 years, but got straight Fs because I hated school. I didn't feel safe. I was constantly being harassed, constantly being, you know, seen as a nuisance. And I got straight Fs, and I only got worse, right? And I got caught up again with graffiti and vandalism because I loved graffiti. I loved, you know, expressing myself through art, through walls. And I continued, you know, slaying drugs and smoking, and I got caught, which kicked me out and placed me in, you know, again, going to court, 16 and 13 years old, going to court, handcuffs on my wrist, right? My little tiny wrist, right? As a kid, 13 years old, no kid should ever be placed in handcuffs or placed in a squad car or in a jail or anything like that, right? And basically was placed in a continuation where the school to prison pipeline continues, right? And on that, that's the story of many Black and brown kids, and honestly, just students of color, right? In our schools every single day, right? That keeps on happening. And that's sad to say. I wasn't the only one like that. My brother followed the same path, my cousins, my homies, and all these things that happen in my community, right? More police, right? Because teens are drinking. Well, why are they drinking? It's because there's hella liquor stores in every single corner, right? So we have easier access to liquor compared to if you go to Wana or if you go to those white neighborhoods, you have to drive a couple miles to hit a Benvo, right? A Bevmo or whatever those fancy liquor stores at, right? There's graffiti, well, because there's no investment in art education, right? So we're seeing these things play out in our communities, and that's why these things happen, y'all.
Definitely. Thank you, Alejandro. Another question I like to pose.
Let's do a
Yeah.
poll real quick, Andre. I'm sorry
Okay.
about that.
No, of course.
So just real quick, just because we're on that topic, we want to go ahead and ask you all, who do you know who has been incarcerated or has faced the criminal injustice system? So we'll take like a very quick minute to do this real quick before we go into the next question.
And we appreciate everyone participating. We appreciate everyone that's being honest, that's being real, because these are real conversations that most people don't want to talk about. And we're seen as kind of like the black sheep of the family, right? Those people that want to be pushed out. So for us, answering these questions, asking these questions, Fabian, right? And seeing the data, hopefully, we could publish this information. No one's putting the real names, by the way. Like, it's like myself, family, parents, like that's important information to know. Like, wow,
Almost done, almost done. A few more people to answer. A few more seconds.
Mm.
All right, we'll go ahead and end it right here. And then Dr. Mika, if you wanted to comment a little bit, please feel free.
Okay, so based on these results, it looks like the majority of people here know someone, not just know them, but are related to someone who has been incarcerated. So a relative, that's 66%. In fact, all of us here are, I would say 86% of us have either ourselves, a parent, a sibling, a close friend. So only 14% don't know anybody who's been incarcerated. So that's very telling. The other thing is in terms of who has a 4-year degree. So when we look at these results, we see that there are quite a few people in here with the 4-year degrees. We do have quite a few professors in the group, and we also have quite a few other people here. And then we have the next is a sibling or a close friend, parent, no one. One of the reasons that we wanted to have this comparison is that basically each one of the panelists has already kind of addressed this in the sense that basically like what Joe Lewis was saying, is that, they would get together and they would talk and it would be like, who's your parole officer? The question wasn't who's your professor, who's your mentor, right? And that's what they would bond over. And then we have Alejandro, who was talking about being pushed out and not dropping out, being pushed out, and our our school to prison pipeline. So all these things that we're doing in our country that make it more likely that certain young people, especially our minority youth, are going to end up in prison than they are in college. And so these are some problems. And when we're looking at it from a systemic level, we're saying this is not just a couple of bad cops arresting people. This is how we've organized our society in terms of policies and especially in terms of spending. So I'm going to drop in the chat. There's a nice table that shows how much money each state spends on education per student versus how much money each state spends on keeping somebody incarcerated per year. And we'll see that for all the states, we spend more money to keep somebody incarcerated than we do to keep them educated. And that some places it's double, tripled, quadrupled. So we also know that the people who end up getting incarcerated oftentimes don't have education. They a lot of times were pushed out. And so, you feel that hopelessness. I can't get a job. I don't have any skills. And so these are systemic problems. And so that's why we're here today. And we have our panelists talking about what we need to do and how it's touched them. So I'm going to drop that in and turning it back over to Alejandra to continue with the questions for our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Mika. So taking that in mind, for our panelists, how do you feel, or what do you feel your role is in supporting those who have been impacted by the criminal justice system? What is your role? What do you do? What can the rest of us do? I'll begin with Joe Lewis, then Alejandro, then Fabian. So
I think for me personally, representation, right? Representation, like you can walk around Mt.SAC and see brown professors, administrators, staff members, right? And you see black administrators, professors, right, and staff members, but you don't know about incarceration, right? You don't know if anybody has experienced what you've experienced. You don't know if anybody, right? Like I was fighting cases, and my mom would ask me like, how much time are they going to give you? And I'm like, I hope there's no murder on the gun, so I don't get blamed for it, you know? Like, and I think, so I believe representation, right? Because oftentimes, like I said, I was in my last position, right? The only person in the room in the president's cabinet that had been incarcerated, right? And that does something to you where you feel like, do you belong, right? Like, and I had to like tell myself, like, I got a master's degree just like most of these people, right? Like I'm working on a PhD just like most of these people that got PhDs, right? But I think that's what I do for my students, and that's why I'm heavily open. Like at this point, I don't care what people think about me being a gang member. I don't care what people think about me being in recovery as a former drug addict, right? About being incarcerated, because at this point, I care what my students think. Because I was a student here at Mt.SAC wondering if the person across the table from me had ever experienced what I've experienced, the professor teaching me had ever experienced what I've experienced, right? Or what they would think, you know, and so I think that's what I do. I represent, and then I voice, right? Like I make sure that when I'm in the room, right? I like to say when people talk about equity, we're the population nobody ever talks about, right? You know, they don't even talk about it. Sometimes they don't even think about it. And that's my job, right? Like to make sure, like, oh, you're not thinking about that. Here, have you ever thought about this? You know, I think that's what my purpose and my job is on this campus, is to represent and to voice.
Thank you, Joe. Alejandro.
Go ahead, Fabian. Go ahead, brother.
Gracias, bro. So I think for me, it's two major themes. The first one is actively challenging these inequitable systems that target Black and brown people, Black and indigenous people of color, right? So in other words, changing policy, right? And so what does that look like? So, you know, with me personally, you know, when I was you know, when I was growing up, we got the you know, again, like I was talking about those negative images of myself, right? And so I didn't get a positive image of myself. I didn't get to see something positive that I could be until I learned about people like Zapata and Villa, right? People who stood up for the poorest of the poor and won against all odds, right? I wanted to be like them after I learned about them, right? And so that's ethnic studies, y'all. So that's why, like, if you see me champion ethnic studies, like talking about ethnic studies all the time, it's because of what it was able to do to me, right? And so I that's why Alejandro and myself, we push for ethnic studies at Mt.SAC, right? We push for these things. We push for a requirement, right? We pushed for these things in 2016, and now, you know, now Mt.SAC is moving towards getting ethnic studies as a requirement, right? Because of policy, because of statewide policy, right? That requires the CSU to have ethnic studies as a graduation requirement, right? Not only that, but pushing ethnic studies in my community, PUSD. Last Wednesday, we got the word that ethnic studies is a graduation requirement, not a semester. We pushed for a year, and we got a year-long course as an ethnic studies graduation requirement, so that people who grew up like me see positive images of themselves if they don't see them in their communities, right? Another thing, you know, my story, I use my story, you know, because You know, again, I give historical context to my experience, right? I talk about all the inequitable systems that I grew up around, right? I talked about how it's more likely for Black and brown men to see a jail cell than it is a bachelor's degree. And that's something that I hold to heart, because when I graduated high school, graduation day was the loneliest day of my life, because at that time, a lot of my friends were already in prison, or they were already strung out homeless on drugs, not knowing who the hell they were. You know, I went to UC Santa Barbara. I graduated, I came back, I was appointed chair of the Parks and Recreation Commission for the city of Pomona. I went to go survey the parks that I represented, which is parks that I grew up going to. I saw friends that I grew up with strung out on drugs, not knowing who they were, homeless, living in the parks that I represent, right? And so that's where I come through with the programming, right? Understanding, taking a critical race lens to all of these different things that I do, and understanding that you know, the lack of resources in our communities, right, is a big reason why these things exist, right? And so that's where I stay pushing for programming in our parks. We started revitalizing our parks, because the way our public spaces looks definitely affects the way we perceive our community, and it affects the way you know, we see if institutions or if people or if our leaders care about us or not, right? So I've changed parks a lot in my community. So that's just you know, a couple of things that I see my role being now, to help people who have been negatively impacted by the criminal and justice system.
Thank you, Fabian. Alejandro, what do you feel your role is in supporting those impacted by the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so I feel my role is supporting youth, right? So currently, I just accepted a position for the Brothers, Sons, and Selves youth coordinator, right? Youth organizing coordinator. So I'll be working directly with youth and making sure we stop the criminalization of Black and brown boys and men of color, right? As well as invest and create policy that invests in Black and brown boys and youth of color, right? And our coalition basically focuses on, you know, making sure we really support youth, right? We give them everything we can, make sure we also give them the tools to organize for themselves. Because my brother Fabian and all of us are talking about us organizing, right? Us viejitos, us older cats. But the truth is that, man, these kids we have to give them the tools. We have to put them on game like that. They know how to advocate for themselves, and they create a much change about that. And we've been doing that for a couple of years, right? With our organizing tactics, and what we've done is that we successfully divested $2 million from LAUSD school police, right, to reinvest it into Black students, right, in the height of the pandemic, right, when all this crazy stuff was going on. We were out there in the streets, we were organizing, right, having youth go up there, speak in front of the board, right, in front of the board of Los Angeles School District, right. So I think my role now is like, as a person that is system impacted, right, is not only just making sure I put myself on and make sure I get make sure I'm good, my degrees are good, but making sure the younger generation, right, focusing before they even get to like have prevent them even meeting a police officer, right. And one thing I want to say is like, I really love this panel. Like, these are my brothers right here. These are my mentors in reality. And I don't know if you noticed, we all graduated different years at Mt.SAC, right? Joe 2014, 2016, you know, Fabian 2016, me 2018. Multi-generational, right? And we're all kind of addressing this issue, or addressing, right, trying to stop this school to prison pipeline, right? And trying to like really create a prison to school pipeline, right? Or even before that, right? In different parts, in different angles, right? With different people. And I think that's what we need to do. We need more people. We need more of y'all to get involved in this. We don't need allies. We don't need no Instagram posts, you know, like fists and stuff like that. Like, we need y'all to come out. We need you to speak truth in your meetings, right? In your instruction meetings. We need y'all to come to the Board of Trustees meetings. We need y'all to be there to support students and show love, and that's what we need.
And if I may, as I'm listening to each one of you talk, I mean, Alejandro, you begin with you're working with youth, like that's your focus. And then from youth, we go to Fabian, who's focusing on challenging systems, changing policies, such as introducing program, like bringing ethnic studies. And then we have Joe Lewis, who's the culmination of being at the table, right? He's at the table, he's representing and using his voice. And that's where we want our youth to go. We can't just have Joe Lewis there. So that's, I mean, wow, you guys are just blowing my mind over here. You're so amazing. I think we have a few more minutes. So if all of you will allow me to ask just one more question, briefly, and if I cut you off, please don't get mad at me. It's just time. The last question is, what are some of the misconceptions people have about formerly incarcerated men in particular and men of color in general?
Go ahead, guys.
Go
ahead.
I think that they're here for something. Well, they are here for something. They want an education. Right? They want a better life. They want something different. But I think, you know, oftentimes, I haven't got it here, but in other places that we talk, one of the questions from administrators is often like, well, how do we, you know, negate the naysayers, where they're like, you know, what do they want here? Right? Like, these are these, like, what do formerly incarcerated people want here? And I'm like, you don't go up to a man and ask him, like does he want to come to college because there's women there, right? Like, they come here for an education. So I think that's the misconception. I think the other misconception is there is no change in people, right? I think people often think like, oh, you know, I think the one thing with formerly incarcerated students, people will think, you know, they're the ones that did that. Like, you know what? I'll accept responsibility for what I did, but I'm also accepting responsibility for the change in my life. I don't negate, right, that I did things in my life, but I don't feel that I should continue to receive punishment for those things in my life, right? And I think that's the myth, right? That like, oh, you know, that there's no change for that student population. We're all the same, right? I think, and when I tell them when they come here to school, it's because they want a new way of life, right? They want a better life, just like a first generation student wants a better life. Just like, you know, Alejandro and Fabian came because they wanted a better life. And I think that's what a lot of my students, and then the research and the people that I've interviewed, they want to give back to their communities. They want to help people like them, because there's so much focus pre-incarceration that we forget. What are we going to do with everybody that's currently incarcerated, right? Everybody's like doing all this pre-incarceration stuff, right? Like that's the other, right? Like there's a lot of focus there. What about everybody coming home, right? Like, how are we helping them with their basic needs?
Thank you, Joe. I can, but
Go ahead, Fabian.
All right, for sure. Yeah, I'll just be very brief. I think Joe Lewis, you definitely took my words away with some of the first things you were saying. Is like change, you know, like common misconception I think is that we don't want to change, but in reality, I think we do want to change. And I draw from an experience that I had in my first semesters at Mt.SAC. You know, like I went to a desk in student services, you know, seeking support and things like that. And I was wearing a hat at that time, and it had an 8 on it. And then somebody at the desk was like, "Oh, hey, what gang is that?" And at that time, like it caught me really off guard, because it was like I don't come here for that, you know, like I could have stayed in Pomona for that, you know, but you know, that's just something that really caught me off guard, left field. I didn't know how to respond. You know, I just, you know, I came to Mt.SAC to learn, you know, nothing else, right? And then another thing is that a misconception, I think, you know, a misconception is that being incarcerated or getting incarcerated helps. Because I remember a comment that my sister made was that, you know, I got incarcerated, and then when I got out, I decided to get my life together, right? And my sister was, I overheard her tell my mom, or my mom told me that my sister told her, I don't remember how it happened, but that she said like, oh, it's a good thing that it's a good thing that he went to jail, because now he changed his life, right? But in reality, most people don't change. Most people go back to jail, right? I think like recidivism in California is like 80% or something like that. It's really high in California, right? Like if you go to jail, more likely you're gonna go back to jail, right? But I don't credit jail for my transformation. I credit the support that I had at Mt.SAC, the support networks that I was building while I was living this double life that I called, that I called my life, where I would come here to Mt.SAC, get my education. I'd go back in Pomona and mess around and stuff like that until, I eventually got locked up, right? But again, it was because of the bridge program. It was because of all of you that are here right now, like support, like Manuel Castillejos, Diana Felix, like all of you, you all played a very critical role, in supporting me and creating spaces where I could connect with students who wanted to get degrees and stuff like that, right? Creating those positive spaces for me where I was not used to those spaces at all. I remember being in Bridge, and like everybody in Bridge, all the peer advisors, they're so positive and all that. To me, it was out of this world. I had never experienced anything like that, and I did not know how to take it in at that time. So just thank you all, for the support.
Thank you, Fabian. And last word but not least, Alejandro, what are some misconceptions that you think people have about those who are formerly incarcerated?
Yeah, I think one might be like we might not, like sometimes they might look like we don't want to get help, or we're just like very, like don't want to talk to anybody, or just like very like quiet and stuff like that. But the truth is nah, like we need that support, we need that love, like we need those mentors, people to come through and really help us out. We need like, older students or OG students that have been through it already to kind of walk us through that, so like I think there might be like this profile of them of just being very quiet and stuff like that. But the truth is like, no, it's many different experiences, many different colors, many different, life goals, and like also career paths. Like, man, they might be ranging from whatever it may be. Some people might think like it's only like sociology or like, something in the criminal justice system, but we got, 5-star students that are majoring in everything from biology to, to political science to, like to winemaking, to like whatever you think of, like there is no set profile, and like we just need overall love and support. And for like, just not to make it too big, I just want to highlight two things, right, for me to close off on my points. The first one being that we need y'all's help now and never, right? Now more than ever, our organization, Brothers, Sons, and Selves, is ready to launch a campaign, right? A campaign that's the Youth Bill of Rights, right? Where we're about to publish, we're about to literally launch this huge campaign that asks for three things: decriminalization now, right? The people's education, and fund youth futures, right? Decriminalize now, where we're asking, we're demanding is that we demand the end of youth arrest in LA County. We demand the right to protect ourselves from law enforcement. Yeah, I said that. We demand alternatives to policing in our schools and communities. The people's education, we demand decision-making power in all public funded entities. We demand all gender identities be treated equitably, and we demand equitable ratios of students to counselors, teachers, and wellness support staff in all schools. In our Fund Youth Futures pillar, we demand youth have opportunities to quality mental health support. We demand every young person in LA County has round of a clock access to technology. We demand youth-based jobs, educational trade programs, and early opportunities for entrepreneurial and development. And if y'all want to get involved in that, please get in contact with us, because this is a county-wide thing. This is a district-wide thing, right? LAUSD being the second biggest district in all, right, of the United States, right? So that's big work. We need y'all's help with that. Please contact me. I'll also put in our Instagram and our social media handles. And the last thing I'll mention is that we're heavily policed, y'all, and we don't have the data for it until very recent. I'm gonna drop a link right now on our Zoom, which is called the $1 Million Hoods Project. Bam, $1 Million Hoods Project, which is basically maps the fiscal costs and as well as the human right impact of incarceration in our cities. And by the way, it maps out how much Pomona, how much South Central, how much Walnut spends per person, right, and stuff like that. And Walnut spends $17,046 $468 in incarceration. In Pomona, They spend $330,000 for incarcerating people. So we got to challenge these, right? These social structures, these funding patterns that we see inside of our communities. And I'll put it right there, y'all. From 2012, that's the numbers, that's the data. That's from UCLA, right? Straight up UCLA $1 Million Hoods with Dr. Kelly Lido Hernandez, who was in that interview, by the way, that film Decolonizing Hombres, right? So check that out, y'all. We have the information, and we hope to see y'all there.
Thank you. We'll make sure, I'll see if we can get your information in the chat. So if people do have questions and need to reach out to you, they can. All right, panelists, thank you very much for speaking to us today. And I'm going to hand it off to Diana. But yes, thank you so much.
Muted. All right. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your experiences and just your truth and authentic stories. We really appreciate it. At this time, we'd like to open it up to all of us here today to see if there's any questions for the panelists, to see if there's any comments, anything that you would like to add to the conversation, to the discussion. At this time, I'd like to open it up to see. Just you can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself. So I'll go ahead and give you all a minute to see if anybody has any comments, questions. I know it's been a lot, right? We watched a very powerful documentary and then heard some very powerful words here from our panelists. So I wanted to just give it a moment to see if anybody would like to, and you can also drop it in the chat as well. We have somebody monitoring the chat. So at this time. All right, anybody? Well, if no one has any, I can't see if there's any kind of a dumb question. There's no such thing as a dumb question, Charlie, but are there any reading or video recommendations to learn more? So are there any reading or recommendations that you all would like to share to learn more?
If you would like, you could Google my name. I have my thesis out there. There's a growing body of literature on formerly incarcerated students in higher education. You could also look up, there's articles called like The New Juan Crow, The New Jim Crow, the books. Let me see what else. There's a lot of stuff. I have to rack my brain on all that. I did my literature review in the summer, so I don't got them all in my head right now. But those are a bunch of stuff that you can read and look at. But I think also looking at like stuff like my thesis, which looks at the strength that people have as a result of incarceration and what knowledge and skills they develop. So looking at stuff like that. There's also a memoir by Luis Rodriguez, right? Always Running. There's different readings out there that you could. But particularly looking at the impact of incarceration on Latinx people.
Thank you, Joe.
So somebody asked me, yes, thank you so much. Somebody asked me a question privately, so I'll go ahead and ask it for them. Are there any initiatives to defund the police on campus? I think that's a great question.
That's a great question.
That's a great
Yeah, I have a lot of people shook right now. Like, man, their faces are stuck. I'm sorry if y'all's faces are stuck. Sit with that uncomfortableness. Sit with that uncomfortableness, right? If we don't have anything that's challenging, right? We have this whole event, 2-hour event, about how this is hurting students, is hurting Black and brown students, and we haven't literally questioned our own campus and what we're doing. I'm gonna let you know right now that back in 2017, we had a racist police director, chief, whatever, and his name was Chief Moore, and he said publicly in a forum that police brutality and racial profiling doesn't exist. and students mobilized and organized, right, and voiced their opinions. And his contract was reduced, right, from literally, we didn't get him fired, but his contract got reduced. Now, it would be a lie if I told you that he was the only police officer in this whole department, Mount San Antonio College, campus police department, that has those views and ideas. I'm pretty sure he's not the only one. He's just the only one that said it. So just wanted to share that because I was there. I heard it. I saw it. I confronted him. And hey, I don't know if he's still there. So y'all should look into that.
He's gone.
Dr. Vika, do you have your hand up?
I do.
Okay.
Well, it's not so much a question as much as, well, it kind of is. I want to know how many people got something new out of this video. Maybe if you don't have a question, what's something that you didn't realize? Because even watching the video, I didn't realize how many Latinx individuals had been lynched. There's a lot of talk about lynching of African Americans, but not nearly as much talk about how many Latinx individuals have been lynched. And to just see those images was very powerful. So I'm just wondering what else, have we not learned, in our history, and what else maybe somebody else, saw from this film that they didn't know.
I think I can say when I seen this movie, how many Latinx people are murdered by the cops, right? Because I saw it 2 years ago, and I think that was astounding to myself, right? So when my students saw it, right, they were like, "This ain't never on the news," right? And one of my students was mad because he said, because we already know this happened, but nobody talks about it. I think that was the thing that was the most, right? Like the criminalization of the Latinx community and the murder of Latinx people is never really televised, right? And I think that was, for me, what I had learned from this film the first time I watched it. Because it's like the third time I watch it.
Dr. Mika, for me, one of the things that came to mind, it's very straightforward, but the idea of policy, what's said and what's unsaid. And, when Fabian mentioned his community being redlined, and not it's just redlining, but, I follow a lot, like the production and distribution of food and the food apartheid that exists in communities that are only 25 minutes away from us, and the way that fresh food is not allowed to enter these communities because of policy, both said and unsaid. So just making those connections. But I'm sorry, Adriana, I didn't see your hand and I just unmuted.
Thank you so much, Adriana McCall, new faculty member with the English department. Loved the documentary, loved the panel very, very much. One thing that I'll just share my video. One thing that I was not aware of, like I knew about the Zoot Suit riots. I knew about the criminalization of brown men. I did not know how far back that history went. I did not know that. I know like the history of like lynching and things like that. But like that piece with regard to criminalizing immigrants, that was like key for me in understanding how far reaching this issue really is. And I mentioned in the chat that right now in my English 1A class, we've been learning about, the push out of Black and Brown students. We've been learning, and my effort is to like decolonize, right? Just as, the title of this forum, my purpose, my endeavor in being an educator is to equip my students with the right language, with the right understanding. And so we've been watching this documentary called Precious Knowledge that talks about how young people in Tucson, Arizona were fighting for ethnic studies program, like specifically the Chicano students, and just how significant and important and empowering having an ethnic studies program is for our students of color, for our Black and Brown students, our Asian Pacific Islander students as well. Because what the statistics and data show us is that it creates this sense of belonging, and it kind of stimulates this desire to learn more, right? They connect with their identity, and with that knowledge, they reach for more knowledge. And so that's why I teach, you know? And so this information it's just been so wonderful, just to sit and just hear the stories of these amazing men and the great work that you all are doing in the community, for the young people, you know? And I'm just in awe, you know, I'm taking it in, and I'm just so appreciative to be in this space. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Julissa would be the last comment. Go for it.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Julissa Guevara. I am one of the social workers from the Equity Center. So one, I just feel so privileged to be able to sit here and be a part of this conversation and hear the stories of everybody here, and just being able to watch this documentary. And it just, to me, it was just a great reminder of, right, the parallels between the Black and Brown community. There's always that historical like dispute, but yet there's so many parallels and the intersections between everything. And it's just a great reminder of that, because we experience inequities on so many levels, and it's intersecting, and with everything that's going on with like immigration right now, and right, I saw this quote that was like, hitting someone with a whip is pretty much the staple, like the American pie of like part of the inequities that are happening. And seeing this just kind of solidifies that, and it's like heartbreaking to see it, and at the same time it just ignites that fire in me to continue being like, no, like we have to continue decolonizing our classrooms by bringing in these conversations, by continuing to have this narrative, and bringing in the voices of everybody, because this is facts. Like the work that Joe Lewis is doing, bringing in the policy, being on the forefront of all those platforms to be able to bring change, right? Being able to have like teach the young ones, like you have a voice. And I personally have worked with incarcerated youth, formerly incarcerated youth, and incarcerated youth. So it's one of those, like, we need them to know that they have a voice in this, and they can be in those seats and in these classrooms. And if we can have videos like these, right, coming into the why not? Let's do it. Decolonize all around. So it's just like so empowering, and I am just like so much around. And thank you everyone for sharing the stories. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Elisa, and for all of you for being here today. I'm going to hand it over to Fabian and Joe Lewis to close us out, and thank you.
Awesome, for sure. I'll go ahead and just I just want to say, you know, thank you, Joe Lewis. I mean, you're the one you're the mastermind behind you know, getting us together and getting this started. So just really appreciate you, brother. Really appreciate everything that you're doing for our formerly incarcerated students, and you know, just thank you so much for bringing us together, bringing this to light, and I appreciate you, man. Thank you, bro.
Thank you, brother, for being the homie, right? Us formerly incarcerated people don't use co-conspirator or conspirator because those are incarceration terms, right? We use homie, right? Someone you can count on, someone you can trust, someone you can be. We don't use ally, right? So thank you very much for when I pitched this idea to you, just wanting to run with it, bro. Like, right, like wanting to be a part of it. I will put it out there. Right now we're shooting for November 12th, right? So y'all can mark it on your calendars. Just like how I said, you know, we have a training for forming ally. We don't call it ally training. We don't call it co-conspirator training, right? We call it a homie training. right? So we will be bringing that to Mt.SAC on November 12th. Put it in your calendars. It should be out later on. We're scheduling the time so that y'all could come by and y'all can learn a little bit more, and we have a broader perspective of that presentation. But thank you for just being a part of. I have to throw a big shout out to Diana Felix, right? When she said I could work at a community college, I didn't believe it, right? And here we are. So thank you all for being here. I do know Fabian will put on a poll. So brother, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, brother. So for my poll, it's the evaluation that I put on the chat. So everybody, please take that evaluation. And while you take that evaluation, I want to hand it off to Alejandro. We're gonna go off script right here because we're dope like that. Alejandro, would like to close us out with a poem. Go ahead, brother.
Nah, brother, I actually want to invite you to join me with this poem too. And let's do the the lucha libre. Let's do the escalator and nacho libre real quick, bro. Come on, to show them how it's done. I don't know if you're down with the 2-piece poem. Already know.
For sure. All right, man. I'm about to relieve you of your co-host privileges, man. But all right, check it out. Now I don't know about you, but I expect to make it. Wearing name brands are naked. And I don't respect a nation that expects us to just lay down and take it, see? Because this feeling I get when my mom comes home from work stressed and still serves us with the best Mexican food in the US, blessed. But I still feel this unrest, see? Because something is not right. See, she tells me, tenemos que seguir luchando. We must continue to fight. Continue to struggle. They label me trouble because I'm brown. My folks from out of town, and I don't fit the puzzle. They burst in my bubble. So I'm out bursting right back. But I retaliate with a pen and paper, no hate, but still mad, still sad, still glad, still filled with mixed emotions. Though I shine bright through the night, I still can't see where I'm going. So I write, and I pass the pen and paper to the homie. Those are the money trees where we continue these stories. See, for me, it all started in a jail cell. My mind wasn't well. My actions were dragging me to hell. And even my mom told me the world was cold, but I felt my heart was colder, so I went for a stroll. I didn't care where I went. I had no cruise control. And with a gun in my pocket, Pomona's my home. Man. But now that I think about it, maybe that's why cops harass and treat people like me like trash. Nah. See, because inequities, my friend, are still no thing of the past. You can't look into my eyes and say that I speak lies when I say a cop kills a young man and a paid vacation is the prize. But if you defend yourself from them, then your life could be the price. Roses are red, violets are blue. My skin color is brown. So what color does that make you? Man, who invented this sickness? This madness makes me sick. Back in the days in the hood, they used to call me Lil Sickle, but I was never as sick as these racists. Nowadays, some people want money, but I could settle for change because people of color work till they die, like slavery, but without the chains. But knowledge is the key, and it must be inserted in your brain so it can flow through your veins to give your children their strength. So when I say knowledge, I want you to unmute yourself and say power. Knowledge.
Power.
Knowledge.
Power.
And when I say knowledge, you say power. Knowledge.
Power.
Knowledge.
Power.
¿Ves? Ahorita me quieren muerto. Amarrado, balanceado como un puerco. You see, right now, people want me dead. I'm not talking about the thugs in the corner, more like Ku Klux and Minutemen. They want my head tied to a rope like Chicanos and Africanos. Back in the day, we had no hope. Never mind, nothing's changed. The system still got us hanging from trees. Institutionalized racism, mass incarceration. Won't let my people free, won't let my people be. Young, strong, intelligent minorities and POCs. They want to see me on TV. Killing, committing crimes, and living up to the prophecies. But they won't show me, or Fabian, or Joe Louis. doing something positive and up in our communities and getting our degrees. If you agree, then repeat after me. And all of you say, let me free.
Let
me
me free.
Be free.
Break these chains.
break
these
these chains.
You see, to have our people in restraints. Chains, I want change. Not nickels, dimes, and quarters. I want you to break that border. Instead of segregating our people, man, how about you show how we're all equal? Yes, we, the people. You think we're evil? Nah, homie. You see, the media's feeding you lies. Open your eyes. We're not criminals. We're people with minds, bodies, and souls. The American dream. Now that is our goal. We try to achieve, but people say no. They say you better stay in your place and stay with your race and stay in your country where nothing is great. Man, we try to escape the place what's called home due to corruption, imperialism, and shit that grows. Violence grows. Poverty, robbery, no food and no clothes. We're stuck in a hole. Or call it a grave. Our people are working but feeling like slaves. I'm writing for rage with this pen and this page. It will make you aware of our people's struggles, stories, and troubles. This is our life. Don't believe me? All right. I'll show you two stories and show you the light. Just listen to me as I spit on this mic. And let us begin with the stories, all right? You see, there's racism around the school. Who makes the rules? Oh, just you? We got to make some changes. Influence on education. Participation of this nation. We're several colored races. In the school, there's more than few corrupt cats who might spit on you just for speaking on the truth. I write these rhymes to educate. I meditate to medicate. Why do people always hate? I'ma embrace the hate and wait and celebrate my brand new state. Khalifa Aslan is my name. My state of mind will never change. Power to my native people. Meshikatiawi like an eagle. Ifamawani to my people. It's a fact, racism's whack. Discrimination across my nation, losing my patience, harmful of hatred due to no immigration reform. They're killing my people and calling them O's. Man, they're saying this ain't your country. You want to start war by putting a fence. It's called the border. That was a plan for nation order. We fight to the death. Mexico won't rest. This is a test of strap on your vest. We taking it over from east to west. This country's a mess. No need to rest. Mic check 1, 2. I'm spitting it harder and rapping it farther with knowledge and wisdom, destroying the system. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been our program. Have a good one, y'all. Appreciate you. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Joe Lewis, everybody, Diana, Dr. Mika, Alejandra, all of you that showed up. Appreciate you all. Have a good night, y'all.